Hello, welcome back. It's been 2 long years, and we're back. I haven't made these videos. I kind of stopped, but I'm going to try to complete the book. I stopped about halfway through. As you can tell, in 2 years I've gotten fatter, a little more gray in my beard, which I blame Obama. Thanks, Obama. Oh wait, no, that's thanks, Trump. It's the Trump presidency. Um, my kids are older, and I learned some more history. Today we're going to be doing the first section of Chapter 20, Girding for War, the North and the South. We're looking specifically at the menace of secession all the way up to dethroning King Cotton. Super fun stuff. So to review, you have the South in secession because of the election of Abraham Lincoln, that Republican devil from the North, according to the South, who didn't even appear on the ballot in a lot of the states, most of the states in the South. And so they thought that that was confirmation of a conspiracy to ruin the Southern way of life. And so they broke away. 7 states secede. And so poor Abe Lincoln, he has to deal with this. On Inauguration Day, March 4th, 1861, this is what's facing him. It's imposing on his presidency. As 7 states are in a state of rebellion. They have seceded. They have formed their own country. The outgoing president, James Buchanan, regarded by many as the worst president of all time, largely did nothing. He believed that secession was illegal, but there was nothing legally he could do about it. And like a parent, a couple or parents trying to fend off a divorce, trying to buy a puppy to save the marriage or maybe have a baby, he proposes to buy Cuba. It doesn't work. So Abraham Lincoln declares that secession was impractical because the North and the South are not divided geographically. There's no giant river. There's no ocean. There's no mountains to divide it. There's a fake line drawn on the maps, the Mason-Dixon line, largely the historical line that kind of divided the North and the South between slavery and non-slavery. He stated that new controversies were going to arise, like a divorce. Who has to pay all the bills? Who has to pay for the national debt? Both sides incurred this debt. So, hey, there's some money issues here. You don't just get to leave and not pay anything, you southern states. Who gets all those federal territories? Who gets the children? The little up-and-coming territories that are someday going to grow up and be big, great big states like Utah and Nevada and Arizona and even Colorado. Oh, wonderful Colorado. Who gets the kids? And then there's the fugitive slave issue. You Southerners, we have this Fugitive Slave Act. You can come up to the North and round up your slaves. Well, now it's a foreign country, according to you, and you need a passport. So, yeah, good luck with that. And then also, a divided America would be something that Europe, specifically England and France, would love. Weaken this growing nation that's going to be a powerhouse. It's going to be a world-dominating country. If it's divided, that's good things for Europe. And then he also, they thought it would lead to them playing balance of power politics, which was all the rage in the 19th century because after the Napoleonic Wars, they have alliances and they switch sides, and that stuff's kind of going on. The picture here is from Lincoln's first inauguration. They didn't hold still. There's a lot of movement there. Come on, people. There's a picture being taken. I'm not sure what's going on. So, South Carolina. There were 2 significant forts in the South that were still flying the Union flag. One, I'm not sure where at because apparently I'm old and I've forgotten. I'm not a very good historian. But the one that everyone knows is Fort Sumter, which is in the entrance to Charleston, the harbor there. The Union had fortified it just 5 days after South Carolina had declared their secession from the North. And so they moved out there. It's an unfinished fort. And they're kind of just, strategically, it was built to be one of the strongest forts in America. They're there and they need supplies. President Buchanan actually tried to send a couple boats. The South fired upon them. One was the Star of the West. And so it didn't work. Lincoln has to deal with this as well. And so he tells the South, that he basically calls them out, calls their bluff and says, we're sending provisions, we're sending food, we're sending water and grain for the horses and cotton candy. I don't know. They're not sending guns. They're not sending cannon and cannonballs and gunpowder and all that stuff. And so he's basically calling out the South saying, hey, we're doing this, and if you fire at us, it's not our fault. Everyone's waiting. Who's going to throw the first punch? Who's going to fire the first shot? South Carolinians, not wanting to to put up with this, a refortified fort, opened fire on the early morning of April 12th, 1861. They fired across Charleston Harbor from the battery at Fort Johnston. People from from Charleston came out and celebrated and cheered. And this bombardment lasts for 33 hours. In an ironic twist, the bloodiest war in American history, the opening volley, there are no casualties. A lot of explosions, and no one is injured. No one is killed. Eventually, the Union surrenders. In the stipulations of the surrender, they demand a 100-gun salute, at which one of the guns malfunctioned and unfortunately killed 2 people, 2 soldiers, wounded 4, and killed a horse. That was during the ceremony to officially give the fort over. Northern people were enraged that they had fired upon Fort Sumter, and so it's time to fight. This is the opening volley. This is the time to fight. Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 3 months. When he does that, the remaining 4 states in the South, the ones that are kind of on the fence, they're not sure, could we work this out? Could we go to counseling and maybe we can all get along? When Lincoln calls for volunteers, basically it's a signal that it's time for war. It causes Virginia, which is a crushing blow because that borders Washington, D.C., Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee to secede, and so the Confederate States of America grows to 11 states. Because of this, they moved the capital from Alabama of the CSA to Richmond, Virginia, which puts it about 100 miles away from Washington, D.C. Lincoln now has a reason for an armed response. Basically, now they have the reason to fight back. And so, in the words of the 80s, it's on like Donkey Kong. Here's a beautiful painting of the firing from Fort Johnston on Fort Sumter, and you can see the American flag flying there, and that's the opening battle of the Civil War. So, the one thing that gets very controversial about the Civil War is people discuss what are the causes of the Civil War. Most people agree, and most historians agree, it was slavery. Many people will say it was states' rights. Which states' rights to what? Slavery. And so the weird twist, though, is there's actually slave states who fight for the North. And so Lincoln has to tread very lightly here. He can't declare this war is to end slavery because he might drive away some very important strategic states, including Missouri, Kentucky, which is vital, Maryland, which probably even more vital because Washington, D.C. would be surrounded by enemy territory, Delaware, which is insignificant and nobody even remembers it's a state. It's probably the most boring place in the country. And West Virginia, who actually seceded from Virginia, the western counties of West Virginia. They broke away and they joined the North in 1863. These are the border states. They are slave states. They're very important strategically. And so Lincoln does a lot of things to make sure that they stay with the North. And so that's why many people incorrectly say that the war wasn't over slavery. It was. These states contain the Ohio River, which is a vital necessity for both the North and the South, especially for fishing. Well, fishing's fun, but shipping, more importantly, and steamboats and sending supplies up and down the river. 300,000 men actually fight for the North from these slave states. Lincoln his official reason for the war was to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. Lincoln's very smart here. To not come out and say this is to end slavery, we're going to ban it, because those states would be driven to the South, and then it would be much more difficult for the North to win the war, and it would take a lot longer. So, like I said, it would cause those states to secede as well. Lincoln was quoted at one time as saying, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." Remember, Lincoln has a very high voice, so it probably, I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. We don't have recordings, I'm making that up. But he did have a high voice. So it's a very delicate situation for the military. I mean, they can't really take over, they can't invade, they can't be the aggressors. So they kind of have to wait around to see what kind of happens. In some states, like Maryland, because it borders Washington, D.C., he declares martial law. The military is in charge. Free press is suppressed. The right of habeas corpus, of a fair trial, is suspended. In fact, the Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, who looks a lot like Skeletor, he declares that unconstitutional, and Lincoln just conveniently ignores it. He sends troops to fortify West Virginia. He sends troops to Missouri to aid civil wars that were already going there, but he doesn't do it in Kentucky. Kentucky's vital for cutting the South in half. He lets the South first invade Kentucky, and then they look like the aggressors, and so Lincoln sends in troops to liberate the state from those rebels. In the South, the 5 civilized tribes, Native Americans that were largely removed from the Southeast by President Jackson and President Van Buren, the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, and the Seminoles all sided with the Confederacy. The Cherokee actually were probably the most slaves of any Native American tribe in America at that time. Most of the Plains Indians and some of the Cherokee, I shouldn't say that the Cherokee were all slave-owning Southerners. Some of them actually sided with the North as well. So moving on, here's a map, and you can see the number of states here. They're numbered by which state when they seceded. South Carolina being the first, then followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. And then those 4 other states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, they don't leave until Lincoln calls on those volunteers. And then you have the slave states of Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia eventually, Delaware, and Maryland. And you can see the precarious position of Washington, D.C. on this map. It's really in a bad spot because it would have been surrounded by completely of the North because if Maryland, or excuse me, the South, if Maryland joined the South. Here's another map of it. Yay, colors. Hey, Colorado's on the map. That's fun. That's where I'm from. And so 1861, Colorado becomes a territory, largely because the northern government, the Congress, wanted all that gold. And actually, there is a battle of the Civil War out west here. Is that the forces of New Mexico, who are a part of the South, the Confederacy, they try to invade Colorado at the Battle of Glorieta Pass to steal our gold. And the Coloradoans, we defeat them and chalk one up. We're on the winning team. Go Colorado. This is a picture kind of showing the North versus the South. The war literally pits neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. This is a Southern soldier. He's a POW, a prisoner of war on the left. And on the right is General George Armstrong Custer. You might hear of him again somewhere, I don't know, or in Montana, some little bighorn thing. So the 2 forces, the South has an advantage of fighting a defensive war. Most of the war is going to take place on their own land. They don't have to win in order to preserve the Confederacy. It's much like the United States fighting against the British in the American Revolution. They simply just have to outlast the Northern forces and make them quit, and they could earn their freedom. So they just have to fight to a draw or simply outlast the North. Lincoln offered Robert E. Lee the command of the Northern Army. Lee fought seriously hard about it. His plantation was just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. In fact, his land was eventually donated to the government, and it's Arlington National Cemetery now. But he couldn't turn his sword against his own men, his own country, or Virginia, basically what it was. Thomas Stonewall Jackson, chief lieutenant of Robert E. Lee, who was also part of the Virginia Military Institute, he goes with the South as well. So most of the seasoned generals and commanders side with the South. The South, although, doesn't have a lot of factories. They don't have a lot of manufacturing to produce the material that's needed to make war. They were able to seize a lot of federal weapons from the North and seize many of the forts, and so they did get a lot of weapons and ammunition and supplies from that. The North had 3/4 of the nation's wealth. They had 3/4 of the nation's railroads. They had nearly twice as large the population of the South, partly because of European immigrants arriving in the North. And immigrants were recruited heavily to join the North and fight for the war for their citizenship. So if you look at the tail of the tape, like when boxers, they get ready to fight and all this stuff here, we look at the North versus the South. The North is also known as the Yankees, or the Blues, or the Union, or Billy Yank. They have more people, they have more industry, they have resources, they have money, they have everything you basically need to fight a war. They have 22 million people according to the 1860 census, 97% of the arms production in the United States, so guns being made, are made in the North. The economy is its greatest strength. They can just outproduce the South. They can make everything they need to make war. That and the significant amount of people. They just simply don't run out of men or out of ammunition or out of supplies. Most of the Navy stays loyal to the North, and so they can blockade the South and really cut off their supplies that they're going to try to import from the Caribbean and Europe. Um, they have better transportation, the railroads. They have, some of the better roads in the North. That was needed because of most of their manufacturing was going on in the North. And then they have Abraham Lincoln, who, not a military guy, he served in the militia as a young man in the Black Hawk War in 1832 in Illinois. But when the war broke out, he immersed himself in the study of war, in tactics, in theory. He basically slept at the War Department to make himself, suitable to be the commander-in-chief. For the South, they are the rebels, the Greys, and notice I spelled that the American Greys, not that British, put an E in it, that's weird. The Confederacy, or as Eric Cartman says, the Confederacy, and Johnny Reb. They only have 9 million people, which 4 million of which are slaves, and so that's kind of a problem. They're not going to give guns initially to slaves. At the very, very end, the South is very desperate. They actually arm the slaves in some places. That represents the most slaves in the entire world. That's the largest slave population. They do have a home field advantage. They're fighting on their turf. They know the creeks. They know the hills. They know the places to set up ambushes. And strategically, they know where to set up defenses. They have a cause. They're fighting for their freedom. They're fighting for their way of life. The North's fighting for union. Not as inspirational. They have better military leaders. Most of the experienced leaders go to the South. In fact, Lincoln will go through general after general after general, much like George Steinbrenner in the 80s used to go through manager after manager with the New York Yankees, or John Elway and the Broncos now going through coach after coach after coach until they find the right one. Lincoln had to find his Peyton Manning. They have a more militant culture. The South was about honor and cavaliers, and they thought that they were gentlemen, so they could lick all those Yankees, and they could fight much better because that's their way of life. Sorry for the bad Southern accent. I'm not from there. And then possibly allies. That's the big question mark. That's how the United States defeated Britain, was to gain allies with France and Spain and eventually Holland. They're hoping for the same thing. So that's the tale of the tape between the two forces. One thing that kind of hinders the South is their states' rights. The idea that the states are more important to the country hurts them because they don't really ally together. They don't work together. They fight separately, and they don't unify like they should to win a war. There's a picture of a Union private, picture of a Southern soldier there. I'm not sure what rank. I'm sorry. But just kind of shows the youth of these young men that are enthusiastically going off to war. Technology plays a huge part in the war with railways and cannon. And eventually at the end of the war, you'll get the invention of the Gatling gun, which is a primitive machine gun. You can see the manufacturing by the sections, kind of some of the stuff that we've talked about. Most of the manufacturing was in the Middle States and the West, very little in the South, which is ironic. The West is so new, and there's more establishments, there's more money, there's more laborers in the West than there are in the Pacific territories or Pacific states, and that's California and Oregon at that time. Only 8% of the manufacturing in the whole country, the value, was in the South. So they don't have the ability to produce what's needed to win the war. And then immigration. You can see that immigration, really peaks. It really goes up during the war, year after year. In fact, the last year of the war in 1865, which has the asterisk right there, 248,000 immigrants came here, largely from Britain, Ireland, Germany, but also Italy and other places, and they were recruited heavily by the Northern armies. Here's a poster of the Garibaldi Guard. Italians coming over, basically, hey, welcome to America, grab a gun. what's more American than that? Not just Italians. If you look at this, you have other languages. You have German, you have French, and hey, you're a male, you're alive. You want to go shoot people? We'll give you a gun and we'll make you a citizen. So come on, let's go. Here's your uniform. You don't need to go find a house. It's cool. Kind of strange. And so lastly here, dethroning King Cotton. So the South thought that their ace in the hole, and we talked about allies, was cotton. Their cotton exports were huge. And so they're counting on foreign intervention to help win the war. And so they basically blackmail these countries. If you don't help us, we won't sell you cotton. And so the ruling classes in Europe actually support the South. They think that this is their way of life. These aristocratic people in England and France, they see kind of similarities in the Southern gentleman and the plantation class of them. The common people, though, they supported the North. They were hoping to end slavery. They saw the plight of the slaves, very similar to their plight as wage slaves, and working basically just trying to make a life. Because of this, the countries refrain from breaking the Union naval blockades. They don't really want to get involved. They're kind of just sitting around eating popcorn going, I wonder who's going to win here. I had a prop today. Wow, I'm Carrot Top now. 75% of the cotton that Britain is buying for their textile mills, which is making Britain a rich and powerful country, comes from the South. They built up a surplus of cotton before the war. They bought it up. They saw the coming conflict and just bought up cotton bales after cotton bales. They stored it up. And so the South literally shoots themselves in the foot. They don't run out of cotton for a year and a half. The war at that point is about slavery officially. You have the Emancipation Proclamation. And like I said, they turn to other places. When the South holds England ransom or Britain ransom with their cotton, they simply get it from Egypt, which Egyptian cotton is supposed to be so lovely and it has a high thread count, which just means it's more expensive. And then also from India. The Southern embargo, it ended in 1863. It just was a disaster. They didn't gain an alliance, they didn't gain help, and they're not making any money because they're not selling cotton. So bad move on the South. There's also king wheat, king corn, which are produced in great quantities in the North. They were sold across the world. They were more powerful than king cotton. I guess people like to eat. Even if you are naked, it's okay to eat. I guess that's good. So Britain can't afford to break the Union blockade to access the cotton. That's all we have for today. Tune in for the next section to finish up this chapter. I hope you like this. If you have any questions or comments, put them in the comment box. Otherwise, thanks for tuning in.